Have you ever wished you could just absorb a language? You know, like how you learned your native one without all the grammar drills? Well, today we're going to take a deep dive into a fascinating approach. It really challenges how we think about learning languages.
Oh, yeah.
So we'll be exploring this 2018 video. It's by Jeff Brown, a polyglot, and he's also a language teacher.
Okay.
And he documented this year-long experiment he did,
Hmm.
learning Arabic. But get this, with absolutely zero focus on traditional grammar.
Really? No grammar study at all.
Yeah.
That does kind of turn everything we've been taught upside down, huh? I mean, we all learn that grammar is like the foundation of language, right? The essential framework you got to have.
Right, like the building blocks.
Yeah, exactly. But Brown, he argues that actually focusing on grammar can actually make you less fluent.
Really?
Yeah, it can create this mental roadblock, make speaking feel all forced and unnatural.
I can see that. You're so worried about getting the grammar right, you can't even think about what you're trying to say.
Exactly.
Yeah.
He even calls it thought monitoring.
Thought monitoring, like you're constantly checking yourself.
Yeah, like you're second guessing every word, trying to remember all the rules instead of just letting the language flow. And, it makes sense when you think about it.
Yeah, like babies, for example.
Exactly. Babies don't learn to talk by sitting there with textbooks,
All right.
conjugating verbs before they can even say mama. They learn by just being immersed in language.
Right, just being surrounded by it.
Exactly. And that's a core concept Brown talks about. It's called comprehensible input.
Okay, comprehensible input, I like that.
Yeah. So it's basically about surrounding yourself with language that you can mostly understand.
Okay.
It's challenging enough that you're learning new stuff, but not so hard that you just want to give up.
So it's got to be like the sweet spot, not too easy, not too hard.
Yeah, like the Goldilocks zone of language learning.
Gotcha.
Like, when you listen to a song in another language, maybe you don't understand every single word, but you can still feel the rhythm and melody, right? You kind of vibe with it.
Right, right. I can see that. So how did Brown put this comprehensible input into action?
Well, he came up with 11 steps.
11 steps. Okay, I'm already intrigued.
And get this,
Yeah.
he actually told his tutors how to teach him.
Wow, that's really taking control of your learning experience. So he really wanted to make sure he was getting that comprehensible input.
Oh yeah, he was serious about this. And to really test his method, he picked Arabic.
Oh, wow, Arabic. Now, that's considered a pretty tough language to learn, right? Especially for English speakers.
Oh yeah, definitely. It's way harder than like Spanish or French.
Right. So even more challenging than those Romance languages.
Way more. The Foreign Service Institute, they rank languages by difficulty.
Mm-hmm.
They put Arabic in category V. It's the hardest one.
Oh, wow.
Usually takes years to get fluent.
Wow. Talk about really putting his method to the test. So he chose a category V language, but it doesn't stop there, right? He didn't just decide to casually learn Arabic.
Oh, no, not at all.
Yeah.
He set this goal of studying for 1,000 hours in 1 year.
1,000 hours? That's like, what, a full-time job?
Pretty much.
Huh.
He planned 500 hours of self-study and then another 500 hours of actually living in Egypt, total immersion.
Wow. Talk about commitment. You can really tell he believed in this approach.
Oh, yeah, he was all in. And that's where those 11 steps come in.
Right, the 11 steps.
They're like a roadmap for setting up the right conditions to naturally absorb the language. The first 3 steps, for example, they're all about acquiring the language, not just learning it.
Okay, so acquiring versus learning. What's the difference?
Learning is more like, memorizing grammar rules and vocabulary lists, but acquiring is more about like absorbing the language naturally through exposure, like how kids do it.
Right, okay, so it's about internalizing the language, not just memorizing it.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And to do this, he chose courses that were specifically designed for acquisition, like the Natural Approach and TPRS.
TPRS.
It stands for Teaching Proficiency through Reading and Storytelling.
Okay, interesting. So these methods focus on communication and understanding rather than memorizing grammar rules.
Exactly. No grammar explanations, no error correction, just lots of meaningful interaction in the target language.
Huh. That's pretty radical, isn't it? I mean, I always thought grammar was like the essential foundation.
Yeah, a lot of people think that. But Brown, he argues that if grammar rules were all it took, way more people would be fluent in multiple languages, right?
Yeah, that's true. I
Um,
know plenty of people who ace their grammar tests in school but can barely hold a conversation in another language.
Exactly. He says we acquire grammar naturally, just like we did as kids, through constant exposure and interaction.
So it's more about developing an intuitive feel for the language rather than consciously trying to apply all these rules.
Right. It's like learning to ride a bike. You don't need to study physics to understand balance. You just got to practice and let your body figure it out.
I like that analogy. It makes sense. So, less thinking, more doing.
Exactly. And that's where those next few steps come in. Brown talks about finding the right teacher, someone who can guide you through this immersive experience. And they got to use the target language like at least 90% of the time.
Wow, 90%. That's a lot of target language. No English allowed.
Well, very little. He calls this person your language parent.
Language parent, interesting term.
Yeah, someone who can help you grow up in the language, so to speak.
Okay, I get it. And he even recommends specific materials, right? Like magazines with pictures and children's storybooks.
Yeah, he's all about making it visual, engaging, creating that comprehensible environment we talked about.
Children's storybooks, huh? That's actually pretty brilliant. The pictures give you so much context.
Right, and it keeps things from getting overwhelming. So how would a language parent use these materials, you ask?
Yeah, I'm curious.
So picture this. You're sitting with your language partner, looking through this storybook, right? They start describing the pictures, but they're using the target language.
Okay.
And they start asking you simple questions. At first, it's just yes/no questions. Then they move on to like open-ended questions. And finally, they start asking why questions to get you thinking more deeply about the story.
Oh, that's a nice progression. It seems gentle but challenging at the same time. And you don't even have to speak right away, right?
Not at all. The focus is on listening and understanding. You're soaking it all in.
That takes the pressure off. I always get so nervous trying to form perfect sentences when I'm learning a new language.
Exactly. And here's where it gets even more interesting. Brown has 3 strict rules for these interactions.
3 rules. Okay, lay them on me.
Rule number 1, no English.
Okay, that makes sense. Full immersion.
Rule number 2, no grammar explanations.
Wow. Really sticking to that no grammar approach, huh?
Yep. And rule number 3, absolutely no corrections.
Wait, no corrections at all. That's surprising. Most language teachers are all about correcting your mistakes.
Right. But remember, this is all about creating that natural immersive experience.
Yep.
It's about minimizing those mental roadblocks, remember?
Yeah.
Just letting the language flow.
Okay, yeah, I can see how constantly being corrected would interrupt that flow.
Exactly. And to further enhance that immersion, Brown recommends incorporating something called TPR.
TPR. What's that?
It stands for Total Physical Response.
Total physical response. Okay, sounds active. What does that involve?
It's basically about learning through movement.
Movement? How so?
Well, like associating words and phrases with physical actions.
Oh, I get it.
Yeah.
So instead of just saying the word jump, you actually jump.
Exactly. And Brown suggests all kinds of activities, jumping, walking, turning, all that stuff.
So if you're really getting your body involved in the learning process, I like that.
Yeah, and he even says you can do TPR even while sitting down.
Yeah.
Like dancing or talking or yelling.
Or complaining.
Haha, exactly.
So it's about making language learning fun and engaging.
And it's something you can do anywhere, anytime. You don't even need a textbook.
I love that. So you've got comprehensible input, you've got your language parent, you're doing TPR. What else is there?
Well, once you've got a decent foundation through listening and interacting, Brown's a big believer in reading.
Reading, yeah, the classic advice. But how does that help with grammar if we're not supposed to be studying the rules?
Well, Brown believes that reading a lot, like really a lot, helps you internalize the patterns and structures of the language naturally.
So you're kind of absorbing the grammar through osmosis, just by seeing it in action over and over again.
Exactly. It's like putting together a puzzle. You start to see how all the pieces fit together.
Okay, I'm starting to see how this all comes together. So you're not just reading for vocabulary, you're reading for grammar too.
Exactly. And to make the process more enjoyable and effective, Brown recommends reading about things you actually enjoy.
Right, so you're more likely to stick with it.
Exactly. It helps with comprehension, too, when you're interested in what you're reading.
Makes sense. And he also emphasizes finding material that's a little bit above your current level, right? That I+1 concept we talked about earlier.
Right. It's about finding that sweet spot, something that challenges you just enough to keep you growing.
So something that's interesting but still stretches you a bit. But how do you know what your I+1 level is, especially when you're starting out?
Well, that's where a good language partner or teacher can really help. They can guide you toward materials that are right for you. And speaking of guidance, Brown has one final, very practical step that might surprise you.
Oh, I am all ears.
He recommends using your phone.
My phone. Okay, I didn't see that coming. What does he mean by that?
He says to record all your interactions in the target language and then listen back to them over and over again.
So like record yourself talking with your language partner.
Exactly. He even recorded his storybook sessions so he could review them later.
That's a great idea. It's like creating your own personalized language learning program.
Right, and you can listen to those recordings anytime, anywhere. You're
Yeah.
basically surrounding yourself with the language, even when you're not actively studying.
It's like sneaking in extra practice throughout the day. I like that.
It's all about maximizing your exposure, turning those everyday moments into learning opportunities. So yeah, that's the gist of Brown's 11 steps. Quite a comprehensive approach, wouldn't you say?
It really is. It's like a totally different way of thinking about language learning. But the big question is, did it actually work? Did he actually become fluent in Arabic?
Well, that's what we'll be diving into next. We'll explore his year-long journey, the challenges he faced, and ultimately his transformation.
Okay, so we've got the blueprint, Brown's 11 steps. But let's get down to it. Did this radical approach actually work? Did he really become fluent?
Well, the cool thing is Brown documented his entire year. And what really struck me is how honest he is,
Yeah.
about the struggles, the ups and downs. It wasn't all easy,
Right, it wasn't just a magical transformation.
not at all. He talks about those first conversations, how awkward they were, and finding the right tutors in Egypt, people who were willing to try his method. That was tough.
I bet. I mean, it's a pretty unconventional approach.
Oh, yeah. Even explaining it to his language partners was hard. But there's this one story he tells that really brings it to life.
Okay, what happened?
So he's with his language partner, right, going through a magazine, and they come across this picture of a marketplace in Cairo.
Oh, I can picture all those sights and sounds, the energy.
Right. So instead of just pointing at things and saying, like, tent or fruit, his partner really got into it, describing the scene in detail,
Like what kind of details?
like how the vendors were shouting, trying to sell their stuff, and the shoppers haggling over prices. He even described the smells, like the spices in the air.
Wow, that's amazing. That paints such a vivid picture.
Right. And that's where the magic happened. That simple description sparked this whole conversation. They started talking about Egyptian food, local customs, even personal memories.
So it went from a basic vocabulary lesson to a real in-depth discussion, just from one picture.
Exactly. It's amazing how those seemingly small moments can lead to these breakthroughs in understanding.
It's like the language suddenly comes alive. It's not just words on a page anymore. It's real communication.
That's exactly what Brown keeps emphasizing throughout his journey. That shift from thinking about the language to actually using it.
Right, right. But I'm sure that shift didn't happen overnight, right? There must have been times when he felt frustrated or lost.
Oh, for sure. Especially when he first got to Egypt. He talks about feeling overwhelmed by everything, like trying to understand those fast-paced conversations. He said it was like trying to catch water in a sieve.
Yeah, I can relate to that feeling. It's easy to get discouraged when you're surrounded by a language you don't understand.
Right. And he admits he had moments of doubt,
Yeah.
like maybe he should go back to studying grammar.
Yeah, it's tempting to fall back on what's familiar.
Totally. But to Brown's credit, he pushed through. He really immersed himself. He went to local events, talked to people. He even started using those TPR techniques we talked about.
Oh, right. TPR, like acting out verbs.
Exactly. He said it helped him solidify the words, made them more real.
I can imagine him walking down the street, pointing at things and saying the words out loud, like a little kid.
Yeah. And he said those actions made a big difference. It was like he was bypassing the intellectual part of his brain and tapping into something more instinctive.
Interesting. So it's not just learning the language, it's experiencing it.
Exactly. And as he kept practicing, he started having those aha moments, where he could understand things without having to translate everything in his head.
That's got to be such a rewarding feeling.
Yeah, it's like you're finally cracking the code. You're starting to think in the target language.
Yeah. That's the dream, right? To think in another language. So did he get to that point?
It seems like it. He talks about having these real conversations, with his taxi driver about the traffic or with people in a cafe about politics. He was even joking around with his language partner in Arabic.
So it wasn't just basic survival phrases. He was really engaging with the language.
Yeah, he was connecting with people. And there's this one part in his video that I love. He's in a park in Cairo, right? Surrounded by people chatting and laughing. And he says, I don't want to think when I speak Arabic. I want it to flow naturally, like my native language.
Wow. That's a powerful statement. It's like he's saying he wants to become one with the language.
Exactly. And from his later videos, you can tell he's getting closer to that. He sounds more confident, more fluent. He's even using those complex grammar structures without even thinking about it.
So the grammar just kind of fell into place on its own.
It seems that way. And remember, this is a guy who intentionally avoided studying grammar. He's proving that you don't need to learn the rules to become fluent.
That's pretty mind-blowing. It really challenges everything we've been taught about language learning.
Right. So what was his final verdict? After this year of intense study and immersion,
Yeah, I'm curious to hear what he concluded.
well, towards the end of his journey, he does this reflection. And you can just hear this sense of accomplishment in his voice. He says, if I can do it, anyone can.
That's inspiring.
He really emphasizes that language learning isn't about being a genius or having some special talent.
It's about putting in the work.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And finding the right approach. He even says he's not a genius, just a regular guy who found a way to make it work.
That's encouraging. It makes this whole approach seem more attainable, like it's not just for the gifted few.
Right. So what were some of his key takeaways? What did he really emphasize?
Yeah, I'm curious. What were his main points?
Well, first of all, I said the biggest obstacle for most people is fear. Fear of making mistakes.
That's so true. I know I've been there. It's like you're so worried about sounding stupid that you end up not speaking at all.
Right. And he says we're so conditioned to focus on accuracy that we forget about the joy of communication.
That's a good point. We get so caught up in the details that we lose sight of the bigger picture.
Exactly. And Brown encourages learners to embrace those mistakes, to see them as stepping stones, like even babies make mistakes when they're learning to talk.
Right. They babble and stumble all the time before they can form proper words.
Exactly. So it's about giving yourself permission to be imperfect, to enjoy the process, even when it's messy.
I like that. It takes the pressure off. So
Yeah.
how do you actually overcome that fear?
Well, Brown emphasizes creating the right environment, a supportive and immersive one, whether that's finding a language partner, joining a group, or just surrounding yourself with the language.
Right, like listening to music or watching movies.
Exactly. It's about making the language a part of your life.
Not just a subject you study. I think that's what makes Brown's approach so appealing. It's not just about reaching a destination, it's about enjoying the journey. So we've heard all about Brown's journey, the 1,000 hours, the immersion, those aha moments. But now I'm wondering, what does it all mean for me? Like, could I really learn a language this way, without all the grammar stuff?
Yeah, that's the big question, right? And honestly, Brown would probably say there's no one right answer. What works for one person might not work for another.
Sure. But there's got to be some key takeaways, right? Things we can all learn from his experience.
Oh, absolutely. For starters, I think it challenges how we think about language learning.
Yeah.
We're so programmed to believe that grammar is the key, that you got to start there.
Right, like it's the foundation. You can't build a house without a foundation.
Exactly. But Brown's experience and all the research on these methods, like the natural approach and TPRS.it, suggests that maybe we've got it wrong.
Interesting. So you're saying maybe grammar isn't the be-all, end-all?
Well, it's not that grammar's not important. It's more about when and how we learn it. Brown's arguing that we should focus on acquiring the language first.
Acquiring, right, like soaking it up naturally.
Exactly. And then the grammar comes later, more organically. It's like our brains are wired for this. We did it as babies, right?
Right, we didn't learn grammar rules before we started talking.
Exactly. So I think one takeaway is that we need to kind of unlearn what we've been taught about language learning.
Unlearn it, yeah. It's like we have to undo that programming.
And then trust that our brains can do this, that they can pick up those patterns naturally through exposure.
Okay, that makes sense. But even if you buy into that, Brown dedicated a lot of time to this, right? 1,000 hours. Not everyone has that kind of time.
Yeah, that's true. And Brown himself says that level of commitment might not be realistic for everyone.
Right. So what's the takeaway there if you don't have 1,000 hours to spare?
I think it's about priorities.
Yep.
Making language learning a priority in your life, even if you can only squeeze in a few minutes here and there. The point is to be consistent.
Consistency. Yeah, I've heard that before.
And it's got to be enjoyable. You're not going to stick with something if you hate it. That's why Brown's so big on finding things you enjoy.
Right. So if you love reading, read in the target language. If you're a movie buff, watch movies.
Exactly. Find what works for you.
Yeah.
And then just keep at it. Don't worry about perfection.
Yeah, that's a good reminder. I think a lot of us get hung up on that, on trying to be perfect.
Totally. And it just ends up holding us back.
Yeah.
So yeah, I think those are some big takeaways. Unlearning those old beliefs, making it a priority, and finding ways to enjoy the process.
Great points. And one more thing I keep thinking about is Brain had a language partner, right? Someone who really guided him through all of this.
Yep, his language parent.
Yeah.
He says that in-person interaction is crucial. But I know a lot of people don't have access to native speakers.
Right. Right. So what can you do if you don't have a language partner, or if you live in a place where it's hard to find people who speak the language you're learning?
Well, luckily, there are so many resources online these days. You can find language partners through apps, websites, you name it.
Oh, really? That's good to know. So you can still get that interaction even if it's virtual.
Exactly. The point is to find those opportunities to practice and to immerse yourself in the language.
So you might not be able to hop on a plane to Egypt like Brown did, but you can still create that immersion in your own life.
Absolutely. And that's what's so cool about this approach. It's really accessible to anyone who's willing to put in the effort.
Yeah, it's all about shifting your mindset, being open to new ways of learning.
Exactly. And that's
Oh,
what we're all about here, right? Exploring these different approaches, seeing what's out there.
absolutely. So, if you're listening and you've been struggling with traditional language learning, or you're just curious to try something new, Brown's story offers a pretty compelling alternative.
It really does. And here's something to think about. If grammar isn't the key to fluency, what is?
Ooh, good question.
Could it be passion, curiosity, the desire to connect with other cultures?
I like that. Maybe we've been overcomplicating things all along. Maybe it's simpler than we think.
Maybe.
Hey.
And I think that's a great place to leave it. Go out there, explore, experiment, and see what you discover.
Thanks for joining us on this deep dive. Until next time, happy language learning.